It's important this week that we stir our souls, incline our hearts, focus our minds on making stronger and more spiritual prayers for our nation and for Shalom HaMedinah, peace in and for Israel, than ever before. This past week, the United States went through a presidential election, and anxiety is high, and yet the promise of democracy is palpable. So many raised their voices and through their votes participated in the process that these lands hold as dear, to count, to stand up, to fight for what we believe is the way forward. We assert as a Jewish people that the Torah has great light to share, lessons for how communal leaders and democratically elected representatives can help fulfill the promises that are bound up in the Constitution. And the more that individuals, through their moral agency and their personal missions to realize their potentials, take on the mantle of leadership, the more we will see this, our United States, flourish. It was the prophet Jeremiah who first said to us in chapter 29 of his book in verse 7, that we should seek the welfare of the city to which we've been exiled. Or if we live in the diaspora, to apply it to our times, it's incumbent upon us to offer these heartfelt prayers for the places we live. For there, its prosperity shall guarantee your own. And so we pray for the ability to flourish as a Jewish community. And moreover, that we should bind ourselves to those citizens of all races and creeds and forge a common bond to not only sustain our nation, but to see it flourish in the future. The idea that we say prayers for the leaders and governmental officials and the country as a whole may have just been bound up with that experience of exile that Jeremiah reflected upon in 586 BCE. But we know that from the 14th century, through the work of David Abudraham, that Jews included prayers for the government in their Siddurim. And they hoped that they would receive counsel, the government officials, to make wise, to make compassionate, to make significant decisions that were in line with Torah values and Talmudic wisdom. The scholar Jonathan Sarna explains that the traditional prayer for the government was first referred to as Hanotain Shua, the God who grants deliverance. But through the ages, 18th century, 19th century into the 20th, there was a combination of the expression about relying on God and a hope expressed that leaders would turn to sources of wisdom and inspiration, such as the Torah, to help guide them in their advancement of our society. We do express that hope. And we express the hope, as the prophet said at the end of our prayer, that nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and neither shall they experience war anymore. Beyond wars between and among nations, surely we use that to express the hope that fundamentalism should be banished from our shores, that violence and murderous rhetoric should have no place in the body politic of our country. As Jews, we especially have learned of the consequences of the ferocity of fighting words and the accusations against politicians and invoking language that calls for murder and ascribes Nazi status to one of our own. Before we say the Tefillah L'Shlom HaMedina, the prayer for the state of Israel this week, we must remind ourselves that this past week was also the commemoration and the observance of the yahrzeit of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, the 25th anniversary of his assassination. We will not ignore that it was a fundamental rift between the far right and the left that created a murderous, bloody situation, an assassination of a soldier of peace. During that crisis, that breakdown of society in Israel, Rabbi Meir Twersky wrote many times that it was an arrogant sense of omniscience and an absolute certitude that was carried by both ends of the spectrum that led to the murderous debates and the bloodshed on the square in Tel Aviv. These are antithetical to decent society. Though we could fight vehemently for our positions as Talmudic culture allows for, and lift that to provide an example for the type of civil discourse that we want to encourage either in Israel or here in the United States, we must be clear in our minds to reject arrogant omniscience and absolute or absolutist certitude. Rabbi Twersky went on to explain to the ultra-Orthodox and extremely religious and right-wing community that they must be as serious as they are teaching Shabbat and Kashrut and Tzitzit and Tefillah B'Tzibor, praying in a minyan, as they are in teaching tolerance and love of the other. And for others who start from a place of tolerance and love, that they could extend themselves a little bit more towards their brothers and sisters and fellow citizens on the right, and begin to create understandings and consider a peace that has as its core a fullness and a wholeness, like the one Rav Kook, the chief Ashkenazi rabbi, the first chief Ashkenazi rabbi of the state of Israel, called for, when he said that shalom is often misunderstood. Shalom, we might think, is sameness, oneness of mind, a shared set of values. But in fact, the root of shalom, peace, is shalem, a fullness, and it's a dynamic fullness, a multiplicitous reality with beyond pluralism, space created in the world and in societies of goodness that allows for different types of cultures to flourish. How do we make space in the future and abandon our fundamentalist tendencies? By more deeply stirring the soul, by inclining our hearts towards the other, by focusing our minds on the great possibilities of the United States of America, celebrating the accomplishments of all she stands for, and the miracle and the wonders and the accomplishments of the state of Israel, fighting for a wholeness, fighting for more opportunity, for more equality, for more beautiful expressions of connectedness to the Torah's most essential lessons. And with that kavanah and that intentionality, we this week offer these prayers for our country and for the state of Israel together. You can find them on page 414 and 15 of Siddur Sim Shalom, and then 416 for the prayer, L'Shlom HaMedina, for the state of Israel. Our God and God of our ancestors, we ask your blessings for our country, for its government, for its leaders and advisors, and for all who exercise just and rightful authority. Teach them insights of your Torah, that they may administer all affairs of state fairly, that peace and security, happiness and prosperity, justice and freedom may forever abide in our midst. Creator of all flesh, bless all the inhabitants of our country with your spirit. May citizens of all races and creeds forge a common bond in harmony, to banish all hatred and bigotry, and to safeguard the ideals and free institutions which are the pride and glory of our country. May this land under your providence be an influence for good throughout the world, uniting all people in peace and freedom, and helping them to fulfill the vision of your prophet. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they experience war anymore. And let us say, Amen. Avinu Shebashamayim, Tzur Yisrael v'goalo, Barech et Medinat Yisrael, Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu. Hagen aleha be'evrat chasdecha, ufros aleha sukat shlomecha. Ushlach orcha va'amitecha lirashea sarere v'yoatzeha, v'tatnem be'etza tova milvanecha. Chazek et yedei meginei eretz kodshenu, v'anchilem Eloheinu Yeshua, v'ateret nitzachon te'atrem, v'natata shalom ba'aretz, v'simchat olam liyoshveha, v'nomar, Amen. A Shabbat of peace, a Shabbat of inspiration, a Shabbat of hope for both this great nation and for our beloved state of Israel.